My wealthy uncle, who always called me the family disappointment, asked about my finances. When I told him, he asked me for a loan. I was stacking cans at the grocery store when my phone buzzed with a text from my cousin Rebecca. Family barbecue Sunday. Uncle Richard specifically asked if you're coming. Says he has something important to discuss. My stomach dropped. Uncle Richard never wanted to discuss anything with me except my failures. The last time we talked, he'd called me a waste of potential while handing out business cards at my grandmother's funeral. I finished my shift, drove home to my studio apartment above the laundromat, and stared at that text for 2 hours. Rebecca sent another message with 3 crying, laughing emojis. He asked what you do for work now. I told him grocery store. He said figures, and walked away shaking his head. That sealed it. I was definitely going to that barbecue. Uncle Richard owned half the commercial real estate in our small town. His construction company had built most of the strip malls and office complexes that lined the main highway. Every family gathering was the same performance. Him holding court in his designer polo shirt, talking about property values and tax shelters, while everyone nodded and laughed at his jokes. He'd always single me out for special attention, asking pointed questions about my career prospects and shaking his head disapprovingly at my answers. When I'd graduated college with a business degree, he'd said I should have studied something practical. When I'd taken the grocery store job, he'd said it proved he was right about my lack of ambition. My Aunt Carol would always defend me with weak smiles and comments about how everyone finds their path eventually. Sunday arrived gray and humid, the kind of weather that made everyone irritable. I drove to their mansion on Hillcrest Drive, parking my beat-up sedan between Rebecca's SUV and my cousin Daniel's BMW. The backyard was already crowded with extended family, the smell of expensive steaks mixing with chlorine from their kidney-shaped pool. Uncle Richard was manning the grill, wearing a world's best boss apron that one of his employees had given him as a Christmas gift. He spotted me immediately and waved me over with a spatula. "Well, look who decided to show up," he announced loud enough for half the party to hear. "How's the grocery business treating you, kiddo?" The condescension dripped from every word. I forced a smile and grabbed a beer from the cooler, buying myself time to think of a response that wouldn't start a family war. "Can't complain," I said, taking a long sip. "Steady work, good benefits." Uncle Richard flipped a steak with unnecessary force. "Benefits," he repeated, like it was a dirty word. "You know what the best benefit is? Owning something. Building something that lasts. That's what separates the men from the boys in this world." My cousin Daniel appeared at my elbow, already 3 beers deep and looking uncomfortable. "Dad's been talking about expansion again," he said quietly. "Thinks he might open a location in the next county over." Uncle Richard's chest puffed up with pride. "Damn right I am. Just closed on another 40 acres last week. Going to be a shopping complex with anchor stores and everything. This family knows how to spot opportunity." He pointed his spatula at me again. "That's something you should think about, nephew. Getting in on the ground floor of something big instead of just collecting paychecks." The familiar shame started creeping up my neck, the same feeling I'd carried since childhood when he'd compare me to Daniel's academic achievements or Rebecca's successful marketing career. But this time felt different. This time I had something he didn't know about. "Actually, Uncle Richard, I've been thinking about that a lot lately," I said, setting down my beer. "About building something that lasts." His eyebrows went up with surprise. It was probably the first time I'd ever engaged with one of his lectures instead of just taking it silently. "Really? Well, it's about time. What kind of business are you thinking about? Please tell me it's not another food truck or craft brewery. This town is lousy with those already." The rest of the family started drifting over, sensing a conversation that might actually be interesting. My Aunt Carol appeared with a plate of appetizers, her expression hopeful that maybe this family gathering wouldn't end in awkward tension for once. "Something in tech, actually," I said, keeping my voice casual. "Been working on it for about 18 months now." Uncle Richard's expression shifted slightly, the smugness replaced by genuine curiosity. He'd always been threatened by things he didn't understand, and technology definitely fell into that category. "Tech?" he repeated. "Like what? Building websites? Setting up computer networks?" I shook my head. "Software development. Specifically, logistics management systems for small to medium-sized businesses." The words felt strange coming out of my mouth at a family barbecue, like I was speaking a foreign language. Daniel looked impressed, despite himself. "That actually sounds pretty cool, cousin. How's it going?" Uncle Richard was still holding his spatula like a weapon, waiting for me to admit it was just another pipe dream that would fizzle out like my previous attempts at entrepreneurship. "It's been interesting," I said, pulling out my phone. "We actually just signed our biggest client last month." I showed them the email confirmation, watching Uncle Richard's eyes scan the numbers. His face went pale as he processed what he was seeing. The contract was for a 3-year implementation of our inventory management system, with monthly licensing fees that added up to more money than he probably made in a quarter. "Holy shit," Daniel whispered, then glanced nervously at his mother. "Sorry, Mom, but seriously, cousin, this is incredible. How many clients do you have now?" I pretended to think about it, enjoying the rapt attention of my entire family for the first time in my life. 43 active contracts as of yesterday. We're adding about 6 new ones every month. The backyard had gone completely quiet, except for the sizzling of forgotten steaks on the grill. Uncle Richard's hand was shaking slightly as he handed my phone back. I don't understand, he said slowly. You work at a grocery store. I've seen you there, stocking shelves. I nodded. I do. 20 hours a week to cover my basic expenses while I build the company. Turns out, having a predictable income stream is pretty important when you're bootstrapping a startup. The word bootstrapping hung in the air like a challenge. Uncle Richard had always gotten his business loans from the family bank where his father-in-law was president. He'd never built anything from nothing the way I had. Aunt Carol was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. But honey, why didn't you tell us about this sooner? We could have helped, given you advice, maybe even invested. The laugh that came out of me was sharper than I'd intended. Really? When exactly would that conversation have happened? Between the lectures about my lack of ambition and the suggestions that I go back to school for something practical? Rebecca looked genuinely ashamed. We had no idea you were working on anything like this. You always seemed so... She trailed off, realizing that finishing the sentence wouldn't improve the situation. Seemed so what? I asked, knowing the answer but wanting to hear her say it. Content, I guess. Like you were okay with just getting by. Uncle Richard was still staring at the grill, watching his expensive steaks burn while he processed this new information about his disappointing nephew. How much money are we talking about here? He asked finally. Annual revenue, I mean. Because software companies can look impressive on paper but not actually be profitable. It was a fair question, the kind he'd ask about any potential investment. But coming from him, it felt like another attempt to find fault with my success. I pulled up our financial dashboard on my phone, the one that tracked real-time revenue, expenses, and profit margins. We did $1.2 million last year, I said quietly, projected to hit $2.8 this year if current growth continues. The numbers seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Uncle Richard's construction company was successful by local standards, but I knew from family gossip that he'd never cracked the $1 million mark in annual revenue. Daniel was doing math in his head, trying to figure out what my personal take would be from numbers like that. Jesus Christ, he muttered. And you're still working at the grocery store? Why exactly? I shrugged. I like the routine. Gives me time to think about problems without the pressure of constant decision-making. Plus, the health insurance is actually pretty good. Uncle Richard finally looked up from the ruined steaks, his face a mixture of confusion and something that might have been respect. I owe you an apology, he said, the words coming out stiff and uncomfortable. I clearly didn't understand what you were building. It wasn't much of an apology, but it was more than I'd ever expected from him. The rest of the family was still processing the revelation that their underachieving relative was quietly building a 7-figure business while they'd spent years pitying him. My cousin Rebecca was scrolling through my company's website on her phone, reading about our client testimonials and industry awards. This is actually incredible, she said. How did you learn to do all this? I started explaining the long nights of coding tutorials, the failed prototypes, the slow process of finding product-market fit through countless customer interviews. Uncle Richard listened with growing fascination, asking technical questions that showed he was trying to understand not just the money, but the actual work involved. The thing that really drives growth is solving a problem people didn't know they had, I explained. Most small business owners think they need better marketing or more sales, but what they actually need is better operational efficiency. When you can show them how to cut their inventory costs by 15% while improving customer satisfaction, they'll pay whatever you ask. Uncle Richard nodded slowly. That's smart. Really smart. I wish I'd understood that principle when I was starting out. The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised me. We'd never had a conversation where he acknowledged that I might know something he didn't. The family barbecue was transforming into something I'd never experienced, a business discussion where I was the expert instead of the student. Actually, Uncle Richard said, setting down his spatula, this timing is interesting. I've been thinking about expanding operations, maybe adding some retail management to the construction side, but inventory tracking has always been a nightmare. He gestured toward his garage, which I could see through the open door was stacked with construction supplies in no apparent order. I lose money every month on materials I buy twice because I can't find what I already have. And don't get me started on coordinating delivery schedules across multiple job sites. I could see where this was heading, and part of me wanted to enjoy watching him squirm. But the business part of my brain was already analyzing his problems, identifying solutions that our software could provide. That's exactly what our system is designed for, I said. Real-time inventory tracking, automated reorder points, integration with supplier systems, mobile apps for job site managers. What would something like that cost? He asked, and I could hear the careful tone of someone trying not to seem too eager. I quoted him our standard pricing for a business his size, watching his face carefully. It wasn't cheap, but it was less than he probably lost every month through inefficiency. That's actually reasonable, he said, surprising me again. When could you start implementation? I'd planned to make him wait, to enjoy having power over him for a while longer. But looking at my family gathered around us, all of them seeing me in a new light for the first time, I realized that revenge wasn't what I wanted anymore. I could have someone from our team do a site assessment next week, I said. Usually takes about 2 months to get a system like yours fully operational. Uncle Richard was already pulling out his phone to check his calendar, more engaged with me than he'd been in my entire life. The conversation continued through dinner, with Uncle Richard asking detailed questions about implementation timelines, training requirements, and return on investment calculations. My Aunt Carol kept staring at me like she was seeing me for the first time, occasionally shaking her head in amazement. "I just can't believe you've been doing all this while working at the grocery store," she said. "How did you find the time?" I explained my schedule. Coding from 6 to 10 every morning, customer calls during lunch breaks, system maintenance after my retail shifts ended. It had taken 18 months of 7-day weeks, but the routine had kept me grounded while building something that could have easily become overwhelming. Uncle Richard was taking notes on his phone, treating our conversation like a business consultation he was paying for by the hour. "The thing I don't understand," Daniel said, "is why you kept it so quiet. Most people would be bragging about success like this." I considered the question while finishing my steak, which had somehow turned out perfectly despite Uncle Richard's distraction. Honestly, I wanted to make sure it was real before I told anyone. Too many family gatherings where I had to explain why my latest project had failed. This time I wanted to wait until the numbers spoke for themselves. Uncle Richard looked genuinely uncomfortable at the reminder of how he'd treated my previous entrepreneurial attempts. Every failed business venture had been met with "I told you so" smugness and lectures about the importance of steady employment. "I may have been too quick to judge," he admitted. "But you have to understand, from the outside it looked like you were just spinning your wheels." The sun was setting by the time we moved the party indoors, and Uncle Richard was still asking questions about our business model and growth projections. He'd completely forgotten about playing the successful patriarch holding court. Instead, he was genuinely curious about how someone could build a profitable company with no initial capital or family connections. "The hardest part wasn't the technical challenges," I explained. "It was learning to sell. Engineers think the product should speak for itself, but customers need to understand not just what it does, but why they should care." Uncle Richard was nodding along, probably thinking about his own sales challenges in the construction industry. "How did you figure out the sales process?" he asked. "Trial and error mostly. A lot of rejection. But eventually you learn to listen for what people are actually worried about instead of what they say they want." By 9 p.m., the rest of the family had drifted away to watch television or help with cleanup, but Uncle Richard was still engaged in our conversation. He'd moved from asking about my business to sharing details about his own operations that I'd never heard before. The construction industry was more complex than I'd realized, with cash flow challenges, regulatory issues, and customer management problems that made my software development headaches seem simple by comparison. "The profit margins are thinner than people think," he confided, "especially when you factor in insurance, bonding requirements, and the cost of carrying inventory. Some months I wonder if it wouldn't be easier to just be an employee somewhere." It was a vulnerability I'd never seen from him, and it made me realize that his success hadn't been as effortless as it appeared from the outside. "Actually," he said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone, "I wanted to ask you something, and I hope you won't take this the wrong way." I braced myself for whatever was coming, wondering if this newfound respect was about to disappear. "I've been thinking about bringing on a partner, someone who understands technology and could help modernize the business. The construction industry is changing fast, and I'm not sure I can keep up with all the new systems and processes." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "Would you consider coming on board? Not as an employee, but as a real partner. Equity stake, profit sharing, the whole thing." The offer caught me completely off guard. 6 hours earlier, he'd been making jokes about my grocery store job, and now he was offering me a partnership in his company. "That's generous," I said carefully, "but I'm not sure construction is really my area. My software background doesn't necessarily translate to building shopping centers." Uncle Richard shook his head. "I'm not talking about you swinging a hammer. I'm talking about bringing your business model to my industry. Efficiency systems, customer management, technology integration. Think about it. What if we could offer clients the same kind of operational optimization that you provide to other businesses?" It was actually an intriguing idea. The construction industry was notoriously inefficient, and there was probably huge potential for someone who understood both technology and business operations. But I could also see the potential for disaster if family dynamics interfered with business decisions. "I'd need to think about it," I said. "Partnership agreements can be complicated, especially when family is involved." Of course, Uncle Richard said quickly. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight, but I want you to know the offer is serious. I've been watching what you've built, and I'm impressed. More than impressed, actually. I'm wondering if I've been thinking too small about what's possible." He stood up and walked to the window overlooking his backyard, where the pool lights were reflecting off the water like scattered diamonds. "You know what the difference is between us?" he asked. "I've been buying existing opportunities. Land that someone else found, buildings that someone else designed. You created an opportunity from nothing. That takes a different kind of vision." It was the closest thing to a compliment he'd ever given me, and it felt strange coming from someone who'd spent years telling me I lacked vision entirely. "There's something else," he said, turning back from the window. His expression had changed again, becoming almost sheepish. "I may have gotten myself into a situation where I could use some financial advice, or maybe even some financial assistance." The admission seemed to physically pain him. Uncle Richard asking anyone for money was like seeing a mountain ask for help moving itself. "What kind of situation?" I asked, though I was already dreading the answer. He sat back down heavily, suddenly looking older than his 62 years. I may have overextended on the land acquisition I mentioned earlier. The financing fell through last week, and I've got a balloon payment due in 30 days that I can't cover with current cash flow. The numbers he quoted made my stomach drop. It was a substantial amount, more than most people see in a lifetime, but not impossible for someone with my current revenue streams. How did you get into this position? I asked, trying to keep judgment out of my voice. Uncle Richard had always presented himself as the financially savvy member of the family, the one who understood money and investments while the rest of us struggled with basic budgeting. Overconfidence, mostly, he admitted. The land deal was supposed to be a sure thing, with a major retail chain signed as anchor tenant, but they pulled out at the last minute, and suddenly I'm holding 40 acres of expensive dirt with no immediate development prospects. He explained the cascade of problems that had followed. Construction loans tied to the retail commitment, supplier contracts that couldn't be canceled, equipment purchases that had already been financed. It was a classic case of leverage working in reverse, turning a promising opportunity into a potential disaster. What happens if you can't make the payment? I asked. Uncle Richard's face went gray. I lose everything. The land, the company, probably the house too, since I used it as collateral. 30 years of building this business, and it all disappears because I got greedy on one deal. The vulnerability in his voice was startling. This was the man who'd lectured me about financial responsibility, who'd suggested I was too immature to handle money properly. Now he was facing bankruptcy because of a single miscalculation. Have you talked to the bank about restructuring? I asked. Tried everything, he said. They're nervous about commercial real estate right now, especially after what happened to 2 other developers in the county last year. They want their money back, and they want it on schedule. The desperation was becoming more apparent as he talked, though he was trying to maintain some dignity in how he presented the situation. So when you asked about a partnership, I said slowly, that was really about finding an investor. Uncle Richard's face flushed with embarrassment. No, that offer was genuine. I really do think we could build something together. But yes, I was hoping you might be interested in helping with the immediate cash flow problem too. He pulled out a folder that had been sitting on the coffee table, filled with financial statements and property valuations. I can offer the land as collateral, plus a significant equity stake in the company. It's not a handout. It's a business deal with substantial upside potential. I looked through the documents, seeing assets and liabilities that painted a different picture than the successful uncle I'd grown up resenting. His business was profitable, but not as profitable as he'd always implied. His expenses were higher than I'd expected, and his cash reserves were essentially non-existent. This is a lot to process, I said, closing the folder. You're talking about a significant investment, and I'd need to do proper due diligence before making any decisions. Uncle Richard nodded eagerly. Of course. Take whatever time you need. Have your accountant look at everything. Bring in appraisers, whatever makes you comfortable. The role reversal was complete now. The family patriarch was asking his disappointing nephew for financial rescue, and we both understood how dramatically the power dynamic had shifted. There's one thing I need to know, I said. If our positions were reversed, if I came to you 5 years ago asking for help with my business, what would you have said? Uncle Richard looked down at his hands, understanding the weight of the question. I probably would have lectured you about living within your means and suggested you get a steady job instead of chasing pipe dreams. And why should I handle this differently? I asked. Uncle Richard was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at his pool, his manicured lawn, his 3-car garage filled with toys he might soon lose. Because you're a better man than I am, he said finally. Because you built something real without stepping on anyone else to do it. Because you have the chance to be the person I always claimed to be, but never actually was. It wasn't the answer I'd expected, and it made the decision more complicated than I wanted it to be. Part of me wanted to walk away, to let him face the consequences of his own arrogance. But another part of me recognized an opportunity to redefine what family meant, to build something better than the petty competitions and judgments that had defined our relationship for so many years. I'll think about it, I said, standing up to leave. But I want you to understand something. If I decide to help, it won't be because we're family. It'll be because I think it's a good business decision. And if we move forward, things are going to be different between us. No more condescension, no more lectures about my career choices, no more treating me like the family failure. Uncle Richard stood up too, extending his hand for a handshake that felt more significant than any interaction we'd ever had. Deal, he said. And thank you for even considering it. I know I haven't earned the right to ask for your help. I shook his hand, thinking about how much had changed in the space of a single evening. The grocery store clerk he'd been mocking that morning was now his potential financial savior, and we both understood the irony completely. The drive home gave me time to process everything that had happened. My phone was buzzing with text messages from Rebecca and Daniel, both wanting to know more about my business and asking if I was really going to help their father. I ignored them for now, needing space to think through the implications of what Uncle Richard had proposed. The financial investment was manageable, but the emotional investment was more complicated. Did I want to be in business with someone who'd spent years undermining my confidence? Could our relationship survive the stress of partnership, especially if the land development didn't work out as planned? By the time I reached my apartment above the laundromat, I'd made my decision. I pulled out my phone and called Uncle Richard, who answered on the first ring. "I'll do it," I said without preamble, "but I have conditions." We spent the next hour negotiating terms over the phone. Equal partnership, shared decision-making authority, complete transparency on all financial matters. I also insisted on bringing in my own legal and accounting team to structure the deal properly. Uncle Richard agreed to everything without argument, probably still shocked that help was coming from the nephew he'd written off years earlier. "There's one more thing," I said as we were wrapping up. "I want to keep working at the grocery store, at least for now. It keeps me grounded, and honestly, I enjoy the work. I don't want partnership in your company to change that." Uncle Richard was quiet for a moment. "You know what? I think I understand that better now than I would have this morning. Sometimes the best perspective comes from staying connected to regular work, regular people." It was a level of wisdom I hadn't expected from him, and it made me more optimistic about what we might build together. 6 months later, our partnership had transformed both of our businesses in ways neither of us had anticipated. The land development project was moving forward with a new anchor tenant, but more importantly, we'd integrated my logistics software into his construction operations and were licensing the customized version to other contractors throughout the region. Uncle Richard had proven to be surprisingly adaptable, embracing new technology and business processes with enthusiasm that reminded me why he'd been successful in the first place. Our family gatherings were different now too, with genuine conversation replacing the performative displays of success that had defined them for so many years. I still worked my shifts at the grocery store, and Uncle Richard had started stopping by occasionally, not to check on me, but to brainstorm ideas while I stocked shelves. "You know what I realized?" he told me one afternoon, helping me organize the cereal aisle. "The family disappointment was never you. It was me, for being too proud to see what you were building."